Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And today I'm going to recreate a single page of a manga into pixel art. The page I've selected for this exercise is from Akira, depicting Kaneda's group running from government agents who are after his friend Tetsuo. I chose this page because it's got angled panels, there's a bit of text but not too much, and there's a dynamic motorcycle shot in the middle that'll be fun to redraw. The first step is to figure out what canvas size to make this on, since that'll dictate the pixel sizing of everything in the illustration. To do this, I started by considering what size the text should be, because it kind of represents the smallest size of detail that I like to maintain in this case. I blocked out the letters in a sizing of 3x5 pixels, and then shifted the bottom rows over to give them an italicized appearance. To get a better idea of the page sizing, I finished the rest of the lettering for the bottom panel, since it has the most speech bubbles and runs the full width of the page. I had initially eyeballed a generous amount of space to work within, but after getting the text and panel frame in, I realized I could push this in even more, and landed on a final sizing of 256 by 360 pixels, which was also selected because it holds the same aspect ratio of the original page. Coincidentally, the sizing is also a multiple of 8, so I'm using an 8x8 pixel grid here to help me compose the remaining panels. There's a bit of distortion on the picture of the page here, but the gutters between all panels are at an angle, and actually only the outer edges are perfectly vertical or horizontal. I ended up using the grid to help me plan pixel perfect angles for this angling, which for the middle panel I found that a line composed of 16 pixel segments approximated the angle in the original illustration. The split between the panels at the top cuts an angle that leads the eye straight to the motorcycle wheel of the middle panel. So to recreate this, I first laid down a guideline going to that spot, and then worked out the angle based on that line. From here, I create the remaining text to fill out the panels to make sure that they also look alright within the chosen sizing. For larger lettering, I like to use a pencil size of like 2 or 3 pixels and write it out by hand, and then I'll zoom in afterward and clean up the lettering 1 pixel at a time. So here's a look at the finalized layout. I'm happy with how everything is sitting, and even though the lettering is taking up a bit more real estate than the original, I like how readable it still is. And I think it's important to push the resolution near its limit like this in order to obtain something that looks very much like intentional pixel art and not just a resized image. As for the illustration work itself, I'm actually going to start with the last panel because there's a variety of character sizes and layering with the cars. So I think of all the panels, it'll be the best warm-up exercise in adapting this style into pixel art. I get this started by putting in some really rough visual anchors for the composition, like using circles for each of the character heads, and then between those I'm clicking while holding shift to generate connecting zigzag lines for the speech bubbles. Of course, when you go creating random lines like this, the resulting lines can be quite jagged, but because these angles can be sort of arbitrary anyway, I adjust most of the line work here to lock them into pixel perfect angles, like using repeated segments of 1 or 2 pixels. In a similar manner, all the character and environment work I'm going to be redrawing while using the original illustration as a reference. I recognize that you could achieve a more accurate reproduction by first scaling down the original and tracing over it at this resolution, but the experience I was looking to have with this project was to draw from a reference and re-express that observation using my own logic that caters to a pixel art construction. The result then is going to be an extra step further away from the original and into abstraction, a bit like a game of telephone in a sense, because not only will it be limited by my ability to adapt the artwork, but also that a lot of the lines and textures will have to work from a pixel art point of view as well. Still, I can see some similarity at least from a workflow point of view, because it's clear that the line work is sort of the place to start here, and then there are shades and gradients on top of that which can be layered in after. What I'm doing at this point is just building up the line work of this panel and making sure that there's a steady construction to everything. In deciding on how to reference the line work of the original, one of the things I would assess first is the silhouette of what I was looking to recreate, and then trying to hit that same combination of angles to get a rough form started. Something like the guy leaning out of the car here, the important gesture is the arm coming down and then back up, and the placement of the head relative to those angles too. The rest of the character is about deciding on the important details, like in his expression we can see his teeth, and those get translated as just a single row of white pixels. The other thing I'm doing with the line work is that I'm generally leaving about a 1 pixel gap between adjacent objects. This is the kind of thing that's not a problem in the fine illustrated work of the original, but the reason I'm doing this for the pixel art version is because I feel it helps maintain a read on the individual objects in the scene. Without the gap, we'd have a lot of pixel lines intersecting each other, and likely making it harder to resolve the edges of those objects. To add the shading, I've created a new layer underneath my line work layer, and I'm using a large pencil size to broadly sweep in some gray tones. At this point, I'm not being too careful. I just want to get the general color blocking in the right areas, and then we'll go through after to tidy up areas that are kind of spilling outside of those lines. The original artwork makes use of gradients and hatching to achieve various shades and textures, and for the pixel art interpretation, I've decided to limit the color palette to only 2 gray tones on top of the black and white, and then we'll apply these in different ways to reinterpret those effects. In the car here, for example, there's the gradient shadow through the window, which steps from dark to light using a series of line work and shade colors applied at parallel angles. We can even go a step further and start to break that line work apart to extend the look of that gradient. You can also see that I've been using this checkerboard dithering as another gradient approach that sort of approximates that halftone printing texture that you see in manga. So here's a comparison of the completed panel to its original reference. Overall, I think the 4-shade coloring offers enough to work with in adapting the manga look, while still matching well with the simplicity of the pixel art line work here. Now that we've tested out the workflow, let's move on to the next panel, which is actually the first panel of the page. And what'll be interesting in the composition here is that the background is at an angle. Now, building a pixel art scene at an angle can be tricky, so what I've done here was just plan out the composition using lines composed of 3 pixel segments, since that seemed to look about right for the angle of the original. I'm comparing with that reference image and placing these lines to become the edges of buildings and horizontal components like the tops of the vehicles. And it can get quite busy to look at, but once you erase some of that underlying structure, you can see the form start to take shape. Finally, I've roughed in a silhouette for Kaneda off to the side, and from here I'll go through and detail everything according to this plan. Alright, and here we are getting the grayscale shading completed, and what I wanted to point out was just the way that we can apply darker shades behind bright spots like the siren lights to have them pop out a bit more due to that contrast. In the original artwork, there's sort of a cross-hatching pattern which draws this focus instead, but I think the key component here is really just that there's that contrast of light and dark at this spot, which makes things like the lights appear even brighter even though they're just the same color as the page. The next 2 panels are going to require a lot of portrait work. And since the blobby silhouette approach worked well on the previous panel, I've done that again to plan out these portraits. Due to the resolution, the lettering in the top panel is encroaching quite a bit on that space, but I've tried to fit the characters into the remaining space as best as I could manage. Portraits can be quite difficult depending on the resolution, and in this case what's tough is that the original artwork uses so many subtle variations in line weight and curvature to create facial features, or to convey kind of the right amount of perspective or overlap in those features. But with pixel art, where your smallest unit is a single pixel, it can really dramatically alter the appearance with every pixel you add or take away, especially on something like a pupil or a mouth. And so making it's sort of like deciding should I make this line in bold or super bold? The toughest one to recreate was this one of Kaneda, mostly because you can see his eyes through the goggles. So within one small area, there's 3 layers of line work to fit the goggle frames and then the eyes. Not only that, but with the tight composition here, I also had to rework his position within the frame. And because he's saying heh heh, it sort of felt like he was laughing at me the whole time while I struggled to make everything fit. But I got something I'm happy with in the end, so in his face, literally. For the last portrait though, I didn't want to repeat the same struggles, so before adding the facial features, I drew in a couple quick construction lines to visualize the midline of the face and the side of the head. This proved to be a beneficial approach and helped me to quickly find the right placement for the features. It seems obvious now, but rather than simply attempting to recreate what you see, it's way more instructive to look past the final product of a finished drawing and think about breaking down the construction to understand how that artist might have arrived there. This was way more apparent with the perspective lines of the backdrops, but it's equally important for the portrait work as well. And working through these 3 portraits was a great way to rediscover that approach. And finally, that'll bring us to the last panel, the 4th panel, but it's really the focal point of the page. And if you recall, we had that angled gutter from the top row cutting all the way down to the bike tire in the center here. So the other interesting thing about this point is that it also forms the center of the perspective of this panel. You can see that all the horizontal detailing of the buildings are drawn straight to this point. This is giving that really dramatic angle to the shot. And to get that going, I've created my own point down at the tire, and I'm connecting lines to that point by holding Shift while clicking. Once again, we're creating a bunch of lines that'll end up with like mixed jagged segments, but these can be erased from later to tidy up the lines, or they can be slightly hidden away in details if necessary. Now, if we look at the vertical angles of the buildings and follow their trajectory, their lines would appear to intersect somewhere way off canvas. So what I did was extend the canvas by 50% upward, then chose a vanishing point that also follows that tire and panel split angle. From here, I'm doing the same thing and connecting a bunch of lines to that point, and this will generate the verticals of the buildings of the backdrop. After erasing the excess construction lines, we can see the dynamics of the backdrop starting to come into place here. From there, I'm doing really rough placement of the characters in the foreground. And again, I'm being quite approximate with the quality of the line work and the silhouettes here. The main objective is just to get some initial form started. And then the real work begins by taking that structure and refining it into the final line work. So with that being said, let's dip into a bit of that time lapse of the character refinements here. Alright, now that the characters are finished, I'm doing a lap around the image to add in other background detailing to fill out the rest of the scene. I didn't want to do this before the characters because I wouldn't want to end up making some details and then having to resize a character or something that would end up covering that anyway. So this way we're just working with the space that's left over and seeing what can be added within those pockets. On the flip side of that, I designed the sound effect overlays after the background so that they would just sit over the detailing. Since they're not an actual organic component of the scene, I think it works well to have them cut over things like that. And I tried to balance their placement onto areas that just had kind of repetitive details anyway, and then also referenced their placement with respect to the original illustration too. So with all that coming together, let's go ahead and take a look at the finished page. Here we go. Alright, so overall I know it's got a bit of that, like, hey, mind if I copy your work, I'll change a few things sort of vibe about it. But I think it's fun to see this sort of stylistic reskin like this. I mean, ultimately this kind of started from the idea of like, oh, wouldn't it be neat to just see this as pixel art? And then it really turned out to be this wide selection of lessons in layout and control of focus through detailing. Quite a nice exercise and a good way to study Otomo's work. And let's close out with some CRT time. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.